Hey guys, tonight we're settling in for something a little different. Go ahead and dim those lights, get comfortable under whatever pile of blankets you've got going on, and let's talk about what noblewomen actually did all day behind those massive castle walls. You know, we have this romantic image of medieval and Renaissance noblewomen, right? Like they were just gliding around in fancy dresses, attending balls, maybe embroidering a handkerchief or two. But the reality? Well, it was a lot more boring than that, and also a lot weirder, and honestly kind of depressing when you really think about it. So let's float back in time and spend a day, or really several days, with these women who had everything except freedom, privacy, or really any say in their own lives. Fun times. First things first, let's talk about waking up, because that's where every day starts, obviously. If you were a noblewoman in, say, the 14th or 15th century, you probably didn't wake up alone. And I don't mean your husband was there. I mean you had a whole room full of ladies sleeping near you. Privacy wasn't really a thing. You'd have your ladies in waiting, maybe a few chambermaids, possibly a younger relative or two who were there to learn how to be proper noblewomen by watching you do whatever it was you did all day. These women slept in your chamber or right outside it. They'd help you get dressed because, of course, you couldn't dress yourself. Those gowns had like 47 layers and laces in places you physically couldn't reach. So you'd stand there, probably still half asleep, while 3 or 4 women bundled you into enough fabric to make a circus tent. The whole process could take an hour, maybe more if it was a special occasion. First, the chemise, which was like a long linen undershirt. Then the kirtle, which was basically a dress that went under your dress. Then the actual gown. Then a belt. Then maybe a surcoat. Then sleeves, which were often separate pieces that had to be tied or pinned on, because why make things simple? And let's not even start on the headdresses. Depending on what century we're talking about, you might be wrapping your entire head in yards of fabric, or balancing some wire contraption that looked like you were trying to pick up radio signals from France. The hennin, that tall cone-shaped thing you've definitely seen in medieval paintings, yeah, that was real. Women really wore those. They were uncomfortable, heavy, and if you forgot about the 2 feet of wire and fabric on your head and tried to walk through a normal doorway, you'd know about it real quick. So, you're dressed. You're wearing approximately 30 pounds of clothing. Your head is wrapped in linen that's pulled so tight you're pretty sure you can feel your thoughts being squeezed out. What now? Prayer, obviously. If you were any kind of noble or royal woman, a huge chunk of your day was dedicated to religious observation. You'd head to the chapel for morning prayers. Then you'd probably pray privately in your chamber. Then there'd be mass. Then more prayers. Then maybe some light prayer as a snack before prayers for dinner. I'm exaggerating, but only slightly. Religion was a massive part of daily life, and women especially were expected to be super devout. You'd have your own book of hours, which was like a personalized prayer book. If your family was rich enough, it would be illuminated with beautiful illustrations and gold leaf. You'd spend hours with this book, reading prayers for different times of day, different saints, different seasons. Some women genuinely loved this. It gave them something to do, something to focus on. For others, it was probably just another obligation in a life absolutely stuffed with obligations. After morning prayers, you'd have breakfast, or maybe you wouldn't. Eating habits were kind of all over the place depending on the time period and where you lived. Sometimes breakfast was considered a bit indulgent. Sometimes it was just bread and ale. Yes, ale for breakfast, because water was often unsafe to drink, so everyone, including children, drank weak ale pretty much constantly, living the dream. Now we get to the main event, the thing noblewomen were most associated with, the activity that defined their existence in the popular imagination, needlework. Oh, the needlework. So much needlework. Embroidery, sewing, mending, weaving, making tapestries, making lace, making everything out of thread and fabric and tiny, tiny stitches that would make your eyes cross. And look, some of this stuff was genuinely impressive. The embroidery that noblewomen produced could be absolutely stunning. We're talking intricate designs, gold thread, pearls sewn into fabric, scenes from the Bible or mythology rendered in thread with incredible detail. These pieces took months or even years to complete. But here's the thing, you didn't really have a choice about it. This is what women did. This is what you were trained to do from childhood. You sat there with your ladies in waiting and your companions, and you'd all sew together. Sometimes someone would read aloud, poetry, romances, saints' lives, that kind of thing. Sometimes you'd just chat, gossip about other nobles, talk about who was marrying whom, discuss the latest fashions. And you'd sew and sew and sew some more. Now, if you were the lady of a castle, you also had management responsibilities, because overseeing a noble household was genuinely a huge job. We're talking about directing dozens, sometimes hundreds of people, servants, guards, kitchen staff, stable workers, laundry staff, all of them needing guidance and supervision. The lady of the house handled the domestic operations. You'd have daily meetings with your steward or household manager. You'd review the books, because someone had to track what supplies were arriving, what money was going out, what needed to be purchased. Cloth for uniforms, spices for cooking, wax for making candles, soap, herbs. The inventory was endless. You'd also oversee the still room, where medicinal preparations and preserves were created. Noblewomen were expected to have solid knowledge of herbs and basic health care. When someone in the household fell ill, you'd be preparing the treatments, creating poultices, making herbal drinks, those kinds of remedies. Some women became genuinely good at this and developed real expertise. Others probably just crossed their fingers and hoped the servants had some idea what to do. Then there was the linen. Oh, the linen. Households went through absurd amounts of linen. Tablecloths, napkins, sheets, towels, undergarments, bandages, all of it needed to be inventoried, stored properly, washed, mended when it wore out. The lady of the house oversaw all of this. You'd inspect the linen regularly, making sure nothing was getting moldy or moth-eaten, making sure the laundresses were doing their jobs properly. Riveting stuff, truly. If your husband was away, which he often was because noble guys were always riding off to fight someone or attend court or inspect their other properties, you were in charge of everything, the whole estate. You'd make decisions about crops, rents, repairs to buildings, disputes between tenants. You were essentially running a small business, except the business was a feudal estate, and also you'd never been trained in any of this because you were married at 15. Some women rose to the occasion and became very competent managers. Others struggled, and some just let the steward handle everything and went back to their embroidery, which, honestly, fair enough. Let's talk about meals, because eating took up a surprising amount of time and ceremony. Dinner, the main meal, was usually around midday. This wasn't a quick affair. If you were part of a large noble household, meals were formal, structured events. You'd process into the hall. Everyone had a specific place based on rank. You'd sit at the high table, raised up on a dais so everyone could see you. Your husband at the center, if he was there, you next to him. Other important family members and guests arranged in order of importance. Then came the hand washing. Servants would bring around bowls and towels because you were about to eat with your hands. Forks weren't really a thing yet in most of Europe. You had a knife and a spoon and your fingers. Delicate. The food would come out in courses, lots of courses. Meat, fish, pies, stews, bread, cheese. If it was a feast day or special occasion, there might be elaborate subtleties, which were like edible sculptures made of sugar or pastry. Swans reconstructed in their feathers, castles made of marchpane, that kind of thing. You were supposed to eat delicately. Take small bites. Don't stuff your face. Don't wipe your greasy hands on the tablecloth. Use your napkin. Don't drink with your mouth full. There were actual books written about table manners for nobility, and they had to keep writing them, which suggests people kept forgetting not to, belch directly into their neighbor's face. During the meal, there might be entertainment. Musicians, maybe. Someone reciting poetry. If it was a special occasion, perhaps some performers or a fool. You'd sit there, eating carefully, making polite conversation, probably dying to just relax for 5 minutes, but you couldn't because everyone was watching. Being noble meant being on display pretty much constantly. After dinner, more prayers, obviously. Then maybe some leisure time, and I use that term loosely. You might walk in the garden if the castle had one. Gardens were actually really important to noblewomen. They were one of the few places you could be semi-private, and many women took great interest in their gardens. Flowers, herbs, medicinal plants. You might have a little enclosed garden, a hortus conclusus, which was like your private green space surrounded by walls. You could play games. Chess was popular among the nobility. Backgammon, cards, once those caught on. Board games we don't even have anymore, with names like tables and Nine Men's Morris. Music was another big one. If you'd been trained in it, you might play an instrument, harp, lute, maybe a small organ if the household had one. Singing was considered a lovely accomplishment for a noblewoman. You might perform for guests or just for your own household. Reading, if you were literate, and that's a big if, depending on when and where we're talking about. Literacy rates for noblewomen varied wildly. In some times and places, most noblewomen could read, at least in their vernacular language. In others, it was rarer. Latin was even rarer, though some very educated women could read it. If you could read, you'd have books. Romances were hugely popular. Stories of King Arthur, Lancelot and Guinevere, Tristan and Isolde. Tales of courtly love, where knights did brave deeds for their ladies. Poetry, religious texts, bestiaries, which were books about animals that may or may not have actually existed, with heavy-handed moral lessons attached. The pelican pierces her own breast to feed her young with her blood, just as Christ sacrificed himself for mankind. That sort of thing. But let's be real, a lot of your day was just sitting around, waiting. Noblewomen spent a frankly staggering amount of time just waiting for things to happen. Waiting for your husband to come home. Waiting for news from court, waiting to see if you were pregnant again, waiting to find out if you were being moved to a different castle. waiting for visitors, waiting for something, anything to break up the monotony. And if you were pregnant, which if you were married you probably were, frequently, well, that was its own special kind of ordeal. Once you were noticeably pregnant, you'd be expected to withdraw from public life at some point. You'd take to your chamber, which would be prepared for your confinement. This meant basically sealing yourself in a darkened room for weeks. I'm not joking. The windows would be covered, heavy curtains drawn, maybe just a little light let in. The idea was to create a quiet, warm, enclosed space, but it also meant you were stuck in a dark room for weeks on end, which sounds like a form of punishment, but was considered proper. You'd have your women with you, your midwife, your ladies in waiting, female relatives, trusted servants. No men allowed, not even your husband. This was a female space. And you'd wait for labor to start, which it would eventually, and then you'd go through childbirth with no pain relief, except maybe some herbs that may or may not have done anything, and no real medical understanding of what was happening. If things went well, you'd have a baby. You'd recover for a few weeks, still in your chamber. Then there'd be a churching ceremony where you'd be ritually purified, because apparently giving birth made you spiritually unclean, and then you could rejoin normal life. If things didn't go well, you died, or the baby died, or both. Childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women. Everyone knew someone who died in childbirth. It was just an accepted risk of being a woman. And then, assuming you survived, you'd do it all again a year or two later, because producing heirs was kind of your main job. Let's swing back to the daily routine, though, because we've still got a whole evening to get through. Supper was a lighter meal in the evening, less formal than dinner, though still with plenty of ceremony if you were in a grand household. More bread, maybe some cheese, cold meats, wine or ale. After supper, if there was no special entertainment, you might have more social time with your household, more music, more conversation. Maybe someone would tell stories. Ghost stories were popular, tales of fairies and saints and local legends. Then evening prayers, because of course, and then, finally, bed, where you'd go through the whole undressing process, which took nearly as long as getting dressed had. Your ladies would help you out of all those layers, brush your hair, get you into your night chemise. And then you'd sleep, surrounded by your ladies again, ready to wake up and do the entire thing over tomorrow. Day after day, week after week, year after year. Now, this is the general routine, but it varied a lot depending on who you were and where you lived. A duchess at a major castle had a very different life than the wife of a minor baron in the countryside. Women at court had different routines than women on their country estates. If you were at court, your life was more social, but also way more stressful. You had to navigate court politics, fashion, intrigue. You were constantly being watched and judged. What you wore, how you acted, who you talked to, all of it mattered. One wrong move and you could fall out of favor. And if the queen or king didn't like you, your whole family's fortunes could suffer. Court ladies spent their days attending the queen, participating in court ceremonies, being decorative and charming and politically useful. It was exhausting in a completely different way than running a country estate. And speaking of queens, their lives were like the extreme version of all of this. Everything a noblewoman did, but with the weight of an entire kingdom watching. Queens had almost no privacy. They were surrounded by people literally all the time. Getting dressed involved a whole ritual, with specific ladies having the honor of handing over specific garments. Even going to the bathroom involved attendance, which sounds like a nightmare, but was just normal if you were royal. But we'll get deeper into specific women's lives as we go. For now, let's just sit with this general picture of what daily life looked like.
Because I think the main thing to understand is that noble women's lives were incredibly restricted. Yes, they had wealth, they had comfort, relatively speaking. They had beautiful clothes and good food and servants to do the actual hard labor. But they had almost no control over their own lives. They didn't choose who they married. They didn't choose where they lived. They couldn't really choose how they spent their time. They couldn't leave without permission. They couldn't make major decisions without a man's approval, their father's or husband's or brother's. Their job was to be ornamental, to produce children, to manage a household, and to not cause problems. Some women found ways to carve out space for themselves within these restrictions. They became patrons of the arts, commissioning beautiful manuscripts and supporting poets and musicians. They became skilled healers or managers. They found meaning in their religious devotion. They built networks of female support and friendship. But it was still a gilded cage, beautiful, comfortable, and absolutely a cage. So that's the basic framework of daily life. Wake up, pray, get dressed by committee, pray, eat formally, pray, sew for 6 hours, manage the household, pray, eat formally again, maybe have 15 minutes of leisure, pray, go to bed, repeat forever. Let's start looking at some specific examples of women who lived these lives and how they coped with it, or didn't cope with it, because some of them really didn't.
Now, let's talk about some actual women and how they specifically spent their days, because the reality was always messier and more interesting than the general outline. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, and yes, we're starting with her because how could we not? Eleanor is like the patron saint of noblewomen who refuse to just sit quietly and embroider things. Eleanor was Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, which meant she actually owned one of the largest and richest territories in France. She married the King of France when she was 15, as one did. Her daily life as Queen of France should have been all prayer and needlework and producing heirs, but Eleanor apparently found that boring because she convinced her husband to let her come along on the Second Crusade. She didn't just tag along quietly either. She brought her own ladies-in-waiting, dressed them in armor for the aesthetic, and generally made the whole thing more complicated. The crusade was a disaster, but you can't say Eleanor didn't try to make her daily routine more interesting than sitting in a solar stitching altar cloths. She ended up getting her marriage to the French king annulled, which was quite the scandal. Then she married Henry II of England, who was younger than her because why not? This made her Queen of England, and she spent her days doing queen things, attending court, managing her lands, having 8 children in between everything else, which honestly sounds exhausting. But here's where Eleanor's daily routine got really interesting. She and Henry had a famously terrible marriage. He cheated on her constantly, most notably with Rosamund Clifford, and Eleanor got fed up. So she supported her sons in rebelling against their father. This went poorly. Henry won, and as punishment, he imprisoned Eleanor for 16 years. 16 years. So Eleanor's daily routine went from powerful queen managing vast territories and playing political chess to woman sitting in various castles under guard. She was moved around between different locations, always under watch. Her days became incredibly small. She could still have her ladies with her, still had servants, still lived in relative comfort, but she couldn't leave, couldn't make decisions, couldn't participate in politics. She did the things imprisoned noblewomen did. Needlework, probably. Reading, definitely, because Eleanor was well educated and literate. Prayer. Walking in whatever limited spaces she was allowed. Waiting. Just waiting for 16 years until Henry died and her son Richard freed her. The thing about Eleanor is that even after being imprisoned for nearly 2 decades, she came out swinging. When Richard went off on the Third Crusade, Eleanor, now in her late 60s, helped govern England. When Richard got captured and held for ransom, Eleanor raised the money and negotiated his release. She was traveling all over England and France in her 70s, managing political crises, arranging marriages. So her daily routine in old age was probably more active than most people's at any age. Meeting with advisors, reviewing documents, traveling between properties, handling diplomatic negotiations. She supposedly arranged the marriage of her granddaughter Blanche to the French prince, traveling over the Pyrenees in winter to collect the girl and bring her to France, in her 70s, over mountains, in winter. Eventually, she retired to Fontevraud Abbey, where her days became quieter. Prayer, contemplation, overseeing the Abbey's affairs, because Eleanor couldn't just not be involved in things. She died there at 82, which was absurdly old for the time. Eleanor's life shows the range of what a noblewoman's daily routine could be, from active political engagement to imprisonment, to active again to religious retirement. But she's unusual. Most women didn't have her wealth, power, or apparently her sheer force of will. Let's look at someone more typical. Isabella de Fortibus, Countess of Devon and Lady of the Isle of Wight in the 13th century. You've probably never heard of her, which is kind of the point. Isabella married William de Fortibus when she was young, and when he died, she inherited his lands. She never remarried, which was unusual and smart, because remarrying meant a new husband would control everything. Instead, Isabella spent decades managing her estates personally. Her daily routine involved genuine administration, meeting with her stewards and bailiffs, reviewing accounts, making decisions about rents and leases, handling legal disputes. She had to deal with the crown constantly trying to pressure her to marry or to buy her lands. She fought legal battles to keep her property. In between all the administrative work, she still did the regular noblewoman things. She had a household to run, appearances to keep up, religious obligations. But a lot of her time was spent on actual governance and estate management. She also had a private chamber where she kept her personal items, including a significant library. We have some records of her book collection, which included romances, histories, and religious texts. So she spent time reading, which was both entertainment and education. Isabella also gave generously to religious houses. She founded a priory, supported others, gave money for prayers for her dead husband and her own soul. This wasn't just piety, it was also politics and social responsibility. Your status as a noble meant you were supposed to support the church. Her daily life was probably pretty routine. Wake up, prayer,
break fast, meet with stewards, review accounts, handle correspondence, dinner, more administrative work or perhaps some needlework, walk in the garden, supper, evening prayer, bed, day after day for decades. She died in 1293, having successfully held on to her lands and power for years despite enormous pressure. She was buried in a priory she'd supported. Her daily life might sound boring, but she was essentially running multiple estates and managing vast wealth while everyone kept trying to take it from her. Not exactly relaxing. Now let's talk about the daily lives of ladies in waiting specifically, because we've mentioned them a lot, but what did they actually do?
Being a lady in waiting was a job, an unpaid job usually, but still a job with actual duties. If you were a young noblewoman of good family, but not super high rank, you might be sent to serve in the household of a duchess or queen. This was considered an honor and also good training. You'd learn how a great household was run, make important connections, and hopefully attract a good marriage offer. Your daily routine as a lady in waiting was structured around your lady's routine. You'd wake when she woke, or earlier, because you needed to be ready to help her dress. You'd attend her throughout the day. If she went to chapel, you went to chapel. If she sat in her solar sewing, you sat and sewed too. If she ate, you'd serve her or eat at a lower table nearby. You'd help her dress and undress, care for her clothes and jewels, run errands for her, carry messages, read aloud to her, play music or games with her, keep her company. Basically, you were a combination of servant, companion, and assistant. But you were also kind of a hostage to her moods and whims. If your lady was kind, your life could be pleasant. If she was difficult or cruel, you were stuck dealing with it. You couldn't just quit. Your family had placed you there, and leaving would be a massive social embarrassment. Some ladies in waiting became genuinely close to the women they served. They were friends, confidants. Others were just going through the motions, waiting until they could get married and leave. The work could be physically tiring. You were on your feet a lot, carrying things, running around the castle on errands, standing in attendance for hours. And you had very little privacy. You slept in shared chambers, dressed in shared spaces, were constantly surrounded by other women. But there were perks. You got to see court life up close. You were present at major events. You wore nice clothes, ate good food. You were learning skills that would help you run your own household someday. And you were making connections that could help your family's position. If you served a queen, your status was even higher, but the pressure was worse. Everything you did reflected on the queen. You had to be perfectly behaved, fashionably dressed, skilled in courtly graces. You were constantly being watched and judged. And you absolutely heard and saw things you weren't supposed to talk about. Court gossip, political schemes, royal affairs. Keeping your mouth shut was part of the job. Some ladies in waiting spent years, even decades in service. It became their whole life. Others served for a few years and then married and left. But while you were there, your daily routine was entirely dictated by someone else's schedule and needs. Let's shift to talking about the actual activities noblewomen did in more detail, starting with needlework, since that took up so much time. The embroidery and needlework that noblewomen produced wasn't just random decorative stuff, although there was plenty of that. A lot of it was functional and also deeply meaningful. You'd make altar cloths and vestments for churches. This was considered pious work. You'd spend months stitching intricate religious scenes onto silk or linen, adding gold thread and precious stones. When you donated these pieces to a church, it was a way of showing your devotion and also your wealth and skill. You'd make banners and standards for your husband and sons to carry in tournaments or war. These had to be perfect because they represented your family's honor. You'd make household linens, tablecloths with your family's coat of arms embroidered on them, bed hangings with elaborate scenes or patterns. These weren't just decorative, they were displays of wealth and status. You'd create tapestries, though large tapestries were often made by professional workshops, but smaller pieces, cushion covers and wall hangings, you might make yourself or with your ladies. The work was incredibly detailed and time-consuming. We're talking hours and hours of tiny stitches. Your eyes would hurt. Your back would ache from hunching over. Your fingers would get sore. But this is what you did. You sat there with your embroidery frame and you stitched.
Sometimes the work was meditative, quiet, repetitive, calming. You could chat with your ladies while you worked, or listen to someone read, and your hands just kept moving. The needle going in and out, the pattern slowly emerging. Other times it was probably mind-numbingly boring. The same stitch over and over, the same colors, the same pattern. Some pieces took months or years to finish. Imagine working on the same project for 3 years, just stitching, forever. But you couldn't really complain because this was your job as a noblewoman, creating beautiful things, demonstrating your skill and patience and virtue through needlework. Some women genuinely loved it and became known for their exceptional work. Others probably hated every minute, but had no choice. The famous Bayeux tapestry, which isn't actually a tapestry but an embroidery, was possibly created by noblewomen, though we don't know for sure. It's 230 feet long and tells the story of William the Conqueror's invasion of England. Imagine being one of the women who worked on that. Years of your life spent stitching little medieval soldiers and horses and ships. Actually, that sounds kind of cool in retrospect, but living through it, probably less fun.
Let's talk about hunting and hawking, because not all noblewomen's activities were indoors and sedentary. Hunting was a major aristocratic pastime, and women participated, though usually in specific ways. The massive, dangerous boar hunts and stag hunts were mostly male affairs, though some women did join in. But there were other types of hunting that were considered more appropriate for women. Hawking, or falconry, was huge. This was hunting with trained birds of prey, and it was considered a refined, noble sport. Both men and women practiced it. If you were a noblewoman with a hawk or falcon, caring for it was part of your daily routine. These birds required constant attention. You'd work with your falconer, but you'd also spend time with your bird yourself, keeping it accustomed to you, training it, flying it. Going hawking meant getting to leave the castle. You'd ride out with a group, sometimes just your ladies and a few attendants, sometimes a mixed party with noblemen too. You'd spend hours outdoors, riding through fields and forests, flying your bird at prey. This was exciting, active. You were moving, breathing fresh air, doing something skilled and challenging. Your bird would take off from your gloved wrist, fly high, spot a heron or duck or rabbit, dive down in a stunning display of speed and precision. If it made a kill, you'd call it back, reward it, praise it.
Hawking gave noblewomen a sense of freedom and agency they didn't get in most of their daily routine. You were controlling this powerful predator. You were out in the world, not stuck in a solar. Some women became seriously skilled falconers. They bred birds, trained them from chicks, understood their behavior and health. It was a hobby that could become a real passion. There was also hunting with dogs, coursing hares with greyhounds, for instance. This was fast and exciting. You'd ride hard, following the dogs as they chased down prey. Definitely more thrilling than embroidery. But these outdoor activities were weather-dependent and seasonal. In winter or during bad weather, you were stuck inside. And even in good weather, you couldn't just go hunting whenever you wanted. There were obligations, household duties, social expectations. Hunting was a treat, not an everyday thing for most women. Let's float over to the topic of books and reading, because for literate noblewomen, this was a big part of daily life. If you could read and you had access to books, you probably spent significant time reading. Books were expensive and precious before printing, so having a personal library was a status symbol and also a genuine treasure.
Noblewomen's book collections often included books of hours, which we mentioned before. These were prayer books customized for the owner. The prayers and psalms were standard, but the illustrations and decorations could be personalized. You might have your coat of arms included, or portraits of saints you were particularly devoted to, or scenes from your own life. You'd use your book of hours multiple times a day, reading the prayers for different hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. The rhythm of the day marked by prayers. But you'd also have other books if you were wealthy and educated enough. Romances were incredibly popular. The stories of King Arthur and his knights, Lancelot's affair with Guinevere, Tristan and Isolde's doomed love. These tales of courtly love and chivalry were the medieval equivalent of romance novels. Some of them were quite long and elaborate. The Vulgate cycle of Arthurian romances is absolutely massive. Reading through all of it would take weeks. But if you were a noblewoman with time to fill, well, there you go. There were also historical chronicles, though these were less common in women's collections. Lives of saints were popular. These ranged from genuinely inspiring to absolutely wild. Medieval hagiographies did not mess around. Saints were always having dramatic visions, fighting demons, performing impossible miracles, and usually being martyred in creative ways. Bestiaries, which were books about animals with moral lessons attached, were common. The lion sleeps with its eyes open, just as Christ was vigilant even in death, that kind of thing. They included real animals and also mythical ones: unicorns, phoenixes, dragons. The descriptions were often deeply inaccurate, even for real animals. Medieval people thought bears gave birth to formless lumps of flesh that the mother bear then licked into bear shape. Reading these books was entertainment, education, and moral instruction all wrapped up together. Some noblewomen also had books on medicine and herbs, practical texts about treating illnesses, making remedies, caring for the sick. If you were in charge of your household's health, which you were, these books were genuinely useful. A few women even wrote books themselves, though this was rare. Christine de Pizan is the most famous example. She was Italian by birth, but lived in France, and after her husband died, she supported herself and her family by writing. Actually writing for money, as a woman, in the early 1400s. Her daily routine must have been so different from most noblewomen.
Yes, she still had to manage a household and raise her children, but she also spent hours writing. Poetry, books on politics and warfare, defenses of women against medieval misogyny. The Book of the City of Ladies is her most famous work, where she creates an allegorical city populated entirely by great women from history and mythology. Christine wrote about what women's daily lives were actually like, and she pushed back against the idea that women were inherently inferior or sinful, which was a radical position at the time, because medieval literature was absolutely full of anti-woman sentiment. But Christine was unusual. Most noblewomen didn't write books. They read them, commissioned them, owned them, but creating them, that was rare. Reading out loud was also a big part of daily life. If you were sitting with your ladies doing needlework, someone would often read aloud to entertain everyone. This meant one book could be shared among a group. You'd work your way through a romance over days or weeks, listening to chapters while you stitched. Being a good reader with a clear, pleasant voice was a valued skill for ladies in waiting. Now, let's talk about something less pleasant: the medical realities of noblewomen's lives. We've mentioned childbirth as a major risk, but there was a whole world of medieval medicine that noblewomen had to deal with, and a lot of it was absolutely useless or actively harmful. If you got sick, the treatments available ranged from might actually help a little to wow, this is making everything worse. Herbal remedies could be genuinely effective for some things. Willow bark for pain, which contains a compound similar to aspirin. Honey on wounds, which actually does have antibacterial properties. Certain herbs for digestive issues that probably helped at least a little. But then you had bloodletting. The idea was that illness was caused by an imbalance in your bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and that removing some blood would restore balance. So doctors would cut you or apply leeches to drain blood out. This didn't work, obviously. It just made you weaker and more anemic, but it was standard medical practice for centuries. If you had a fever, they might bleed you. If you had a headache, bleeding. Feeling tired, probably need to be bled. It was the answer to everything, and it helped with nothing. Noblewomen also dealt with the fun world of gynecological issues, about which medieval medicine understood essentially nothing. Menstruation was poorly understood and considered spiritually polluting. If you had painful or irregular periods, the medical advice ranged from useless to bizarre. Pregnancy and childbirth we've covered, but it's worth emphasizing how terrifying it must have been. You knew that you or your baby or both might die. You'd seen it happen to other women. Your own mother might have died giving birth to you or a sibling. And there was nothing you could do to make it safer except pray and hope. You'd have your midwife, who had experience, but no real medical training. She'd have her techniques and tricks passed down from other midwives. Some of them helped, many didn't. If something went seriously wrong, there was no solution. Women would make wills before going into labor, just in case. They'd receive the sacraments. They'd pray to specific saints associated with childbirth. Saint Margaret of Antioch was a popular one, supposedly because she was swallowed by a dragon and burst out of its belly, which medieval people thought was a good parallel to childbirth. Comforting. If you survived childbirth repeatedly and made it to menopause, you'd probably have health issues from all those pregnancies. Your teeth might be ruined.
because medieval people thought that pregnancy drained calcium and ruined your teeth, which, to be fair, it kind of did if you weren't getting enough nutrition, and dental care was essentially non-existent. Tooth pain was treated with prayers, herbal rinses that probably didn't help much, and eventually just pulling the tooth out with pliers. No anesthetic, just someone yanking your tooth out while you screamed. So your daily routine might include chronic pain that you just had to live with, toothaches, joint pain, headaches, digestive issues. You'd take whatever herbal remedies were available, pray, and keep going, because what else could you do? Some women became seriously interested in medicine and healing, learning everything they could about herbs and treatments. They'd create still room recipes, experiment with different combinations, build up knowledge about what actually worked. These women were valuable to their households and communities. People would come to them for help with illnesses and injuries. They'd prepare medicines, treat wounds, help with difficult births. But they were working with limited knowledge and limited tools. They were doing their best in a world that didn't understand germ theory or anatomy or basic hygiene.
Let's move on to something slightly cheerier: entertainment and celebrations. Daily life for noble women wasn't all tedium and danger. There were festivals, feasts, celebrations. These broke up the routine and gave everyone something to look forward to. Religious feast days were the main celebrations: Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, and various saints' days. On these days, there'd be special church services, obviously, but also feasting and entertainment. The Christmas season was particularly big. This wasn't just one day, but the whole period from Christmas to Twelfth Night. There'd be feasting, games, music, performances. If you were in a large, noble household or at court, there'd be elaborate entertainments, mummers, plays, dancing. As a noblewoman, you'd be expected to participate and also to help organize everything. You'd oversee the preparations, make sure the hall was decorated, ensure the kitchens were producing appropriate feast dishes. You'd wear your best clothes, your best jewels. You'd be on display, representing your family's status and wealth. There'd be dancing, which was a major social activity. Medieval and Renaissance dances were intricate and formal, with specific steps that everyone needed to know. If you didn't know the current fashionable dances, you'd look foolish. So learning and practicing dances was part of a noblewoman's education.
You'd dance with your husband, with other nobles, going through the elaborate figures while musicians played. It was social, fun, but also a performance. Everyone watching everyone else, judging their skill and grace. There'd be music performances, professional musicians if your household could afford them, or talented members of the household showing off their skills. Songs, instrumental pieces. Some of the music was religious, some was secular. Love songs were hugely popular, tales of unrequited longing and courtly devotion. Tournaments were another major form of entertainment, though as a noblewoman, you were mostly a spectator. You'd sit in the stands, watching knights joust and fight in mock combat. You might give your favor to a knight, a scarf or ribbon he'd wear while competing. This was all tied into the whole courtly love tradition, where knights supposedly fought for the honor of their chosen lady. In reality, they were fighting for glory and prizes and to show off, but the romantic framing was important to the culture. As a noblewoman, you were supposed to be the inspirer of great deeds. You'd watch elegantly, applaud at the right moments, perhaps crown the victor with a wreath. You were decorative and symbolic, the prize and the audience, but not a participant. Some women apparently found this boring because there are records of noble women sneaking off during tournaments to do other things. Can't imagine why watching men hit each other with sticks for hours would get old. Weddings were major celebrations, and as a noblewoman, you would attend many weddings. Other people's, your children's, your relatives. Each one meant days of celebration, feasting, dancing, entertainment. If it was your own child's wedding, you'd be intimately involved in planning and organizing everything: the betrothal negotiations, the marriage contracts, the ceremony itself, the feast afterward. All of it had to be perfect, because this was a major political and social event. And then there were the quieter entertainments: games, conversation, music making among your household. These were the everyday pleasures that made life bearable. Playing chess with a companion, listening to a new song, hearing the latest gossip from court, walking in the garden on a nice day, reading a new romance. These small pleasures punctuated the routine. Some noblewomen kept pets, which added interest to daily life. Small dogs were particularly popular. You'd have a little lap dog that would follow you around, sleep in your chamber, get absurdly spoiled. These dogs were status symbols, but also genuine companions. There are medieval illustrations showing noblewomen with their little dogs, carrying them, feeding them from the table, letting them sit on their laps during meals. People loved their pets just as much then as now.
Some women also kept birds beyond hunting birds. Songbirds in cages, parrots if you were very wealthy and had access to exotic imports. Anything to add some life and interest to your daily surroundings. Let's talk about the seasonal rhythms of noble life, because your daily routine changed depending on the time of year. In summer, life was more active. You could spend time outdoors. Gardens were in bloom. Hunting and hawking were easier. If your household traveled between different estates, summer was when you'd make those journeys. Travel was slow and complicated. If you were moving your entire household from one castle to another, it was a massive undertaking. All your belongings had to be packed up. Your clothes, your books, your jewels, your household furnishings. Everything loaded into carts and wagons. Then you'd process to the new location, riding on horseback or in a litter if you preferred. The journey could take days or weeks depending on the distance. You'd stop at other noble houses along the way, or at monasteries, or set up temporary camps. As a noblewoman, you'd have to maintain your dignity and composure through all of this. No complaining about being saddle-sore or tired. You'd arrive at each stop looking composed and gracious, ready to be a guest or to set up your household in a new location.
Once you arrived, you'd have to settle in, supervise unpacking, make sure your chambers were arranged properly, re-establish the household routine in a new place. In winter, everything contracted. You stayed indoors more. Travel was difficult or impossible. Your daily routine became more limited. More time in your solar with your ladies doing needlework by whatever light you could get. More time in your chamber staying warm by the fire. Winter was harder, colder, darker, more isolated. If you were in a remote castle, you might not see anyone from outside your household for months. Just the same faces, the same rooms, the same routine, day after day.
This is when having books and music and games became really important. You needed something to fill the long, dark evenings. Stories, songs, entertainment created by and for your household. Spring brought relief, warmer weather, longer days, gardens coming back to life, the possibility of travel again, Easter celebrations, the world opening back up after winter's confinement. Autumn was harvest time, which meant your administrative duties increased if you were managing estates, overseeing the harvest, making sure crops were stored properly, collecting rents from tenants. The household had to be prepared for winter, food stored, supplies laid in, everything secured.
As lady of the estate, you'd be involved in all of this. Meeting with your steward, reviewing what had been harvested and stored, making sure the household had what it needed to get through winter. This seasonal rhythm structured the year, the same cycle repeating year after year, the tasks and celebrations coming around again and again. Your daily life was both routine and varied. The basic structure stayed the same: wake, dress, pray, eat, work, pray, eat, sleep. But within that structure, there was variation. Different tasks depending on the season, different celebrations throughout the year, different challenges and crises. And underneath it all, the constant uncertainty. You might get pregnant again. Your husband might die. You might get sick. Your children might die. War might come. Plague might come. Your family's political fortunes might shift. Noblewomen lived with a lot of anxiety underneath the surface of their daily routines. Yes, they had comfort and privilege, but they also had very little control and very real dangers. So they filled their days with prayer, work, small pleasures, and tried to find meaning and satisfaction where they could. Some succeeded, some didn't, and many probably never even thought about it in those terms. This was just life. What else would you expect?
Let's drift into talking about the religious side of noblewomen's lives in more detail, because we've mentioned prayer a lot, but it was genuinely central to everything. Religion wasn't just something you did on Sundays. It permeated every single aspect of daily life. You woke up and prayed. You prayed before meals. You attended Mass. You prayed privately throughout the day. You prayed before bed. Prayer was the background music to your entire existence. For some women, this was genuinely fulfilling. Religious devotion gave their lives structure and meaning. They found comfort in prayer, in the rituals, in the connection to something bigger than themselves. But the level of devotion expected was intense. You weren't just supposed to go through the motions. You were supposed to be genuinely pious, humble, devoted. Your spiritual state was considered more important than almost anything else about you. There were certain saints that noblewomen had special connections to. Saint Margaret, as we mentioned, for childbirth. Saint Catherine of Alexandria for learning and wisdom. Saint Mary Magdalene, who was held up as the model of the reformed sinner. The Virgin Mary, obviously, who was the ultimate model of feminine virtue, pure, humble, obedient, devoted to her Son. You'd pray to these saints for intercession. If you wanted to get pregnant, you'd pray to Saint Anne. If you had eye problems, Saint Lucy. Specific saints for specific problems, like a celestial customer service department.
Many noblewomen went on pilgrimage, which was both a religious act and a form of travel and adventure. If you could convince your husband or father to let you go, pilgrimage gave you a legitimate reason to leave home and see new places. The most ambitious pilgrimage was to Jerusalem, which was dangerous, expensive, and took months or even years. Most women didn't attempt it. But there were plenty of other pilgrimage sites. Canterbury in England with the shrine of Thomas Becket, Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Rome, obviously, dozens of smaller local shrines throughout Europe. Going on pilgrimage meant weeks of travel. You'd walk or ride to the holy site, pray there, maybe leave an offering, then make the journey home. You'd travel with a group for safety, wearing pilgrim's badges to show your purpose. For noblewomen, pilgrimage was never quite as rough as it was for common people. You'd stay in better accommodations, have servants with you, travel with more comfort. But it was still travel, still exposure to the wider world, still a break from the usual routine. Some women took their pilgrimage seriously as a spiritual journey. Others probably enjoyed it more as an excuse for an adventure. And some did both, genuinely devotional, but also glad for the change of scenery. There were also women who took their religious devotion to an extreme and became anchoresses. An anchoress was a woman who was literally walled up in a small cell, usually attached to a church, to spend her life in prayer and contemplation. The cell would have a window to the church so she could follow the services. Another window to the outside where people could come for spiritual advice. A servant would bring food and take away waste, and that was it. You'd spend the rest of your life in this tiny space, praying. This was considered incredibly holy and admirable. When a woman became an anchoress, there was a ceremony similar to a funeral because she was dying to the world. Then she'd be sealed in her cell forever. Julian of Norwich was probably the most famous anchoress. She lived in her cell for decades and wrote about her visions and mystical experiences. Her daily routine was prayer, contemplation, more prayer, eating occasionally, sleeping, more prayer, for years and years and years. She seemed genuinely content with this life. Her writings are actually quite beautiful and optimistic. All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. That's her most famous line. But imagine it, choosing to spend the rest of your life in a tiny cell, never leaving, never seeing the sky except through a small window, never walking outside, never riding a horse, never attending a feast or wedding or any social event. Just you and your prayers and your visions. For some women, this was genuinely their calling. They wanted this life of total devotion. For others, it might have been the only way to escape marriage and childbirth. If you absolutely didn't want to marry, becoming a nun or an anchoress was pretty much your only option. Most noble women didn't go that far, obviously, but many did enter convents, either by choice or because their families decided that's what would happen. Convent life had its own daily routine, which was in some ways stricter and in other ways more free than secular life. You had to follow the monastic schedule. Up before dawn for the first prayers of the day, more prayers throughout the day at set hours, work in between, whatever the convent's particular focus was, copying manuscripts, making embroidery, growing herbs, teaching girls. But you also didn't have to deal with a husband. You weren't going to die in childbirth. You had a community of women. If you were literate and scholarly, convent life might give you more access to books and learning than you'd have in secular life. Some convents were quite relaxed, especially ones for noblewomen. You might have your own room, your own servants, a fairly comfortable life. Other convents were strict, with rules about poverty, silence, and hard work. And some women who entered convents didn't want to be there at all. They'd been sent by their families because there wasn't money for a dowry, or because they were inconvenient somehow. These women might spend decades in the convent, going through the motions, never really embracing the life. There are records of nuns behaving badly, sneaking out, having affairs, hosting parties in the convent, refusing to follow the rules. Abbesses constantly had to issue reminders about proper behavior. Stop bringing your pet dogs into the chapel. No more fancy clothes under your habit. Please stop flirting with men through the convent gate. Nuns were human, and not all of them wanted to be there. And some of them coped by just ignoring as many rules as they could get away with. But back to noblewomen living secular lives. Let's talk about their relationships with their husbands, because that was obviously a huge part of daily existence. Noble marriages were arranged. You didn't marry for love. You married for political alliance, for land, for money, for family connections. Love, if it happened, was a bonus. Some couples did develop genuine affection over time. You were living together, sleeping together, having children together. Shared experiences and mutual respect could turn into something like love. Other marriages were cold arrangements. You fulfilled your duties, he fulfilled his, and that was it. You didn't expect warmth or companionship. You had your household, your ladies, your children. He had his interests, his companions, his affairs. Because affairs were pretty much assumed for noblemen. Your husband was probably going to sleep with other women. Servants, ladies of the court, mistresses he'd set up in nice houses somewhere. This was just normal. You were expected to ignore it. Pretend you didn't know. Maintain your dignity. Don't make a fuss. If your husband brought his mistress to live at the castle, which some men did, you were supposed to just tolerate it. Be gracious, because making a scene would embarrass your family and make you look shrewish and difficult. Some women managed this with genuine grace. Others seethed with resentment, but hid it. Some didn't hide it and had screaming fights with their husbands. A few arranged for their husbands' mistresses to have unfortunate accidents, though that was risky. Queens and high noblewomen had it worse in some ways because their husbands' affairs were public knowledge. Everyone knew. Everyone gossiped about it. You had to smile and maintain dignity while everyone whispered about your husband's latest mistress. Henry II of England, Eleanor of Aquitaire's husband, famously carried on with Rosamond Clifford so openly that it was a scandal even by royal standards. There were stories that Eleanor had Rosamond killed, though that's probably not true. But the fact that people found it believable shows how these situations could make women desperate. Your daily routine with your husband varied a lot. If you got along, you might spend time together, eat meals together, go hawking together, play chess in the evening. You might genuinely enjoy each other's company. If you didn't get along, you'd minimize contact. He'd be in his chambers or in the hall with his men. You'd be in your solar with your ladies. You'd see each other at formal meals, and that's it. At night, He might come to your chamber for sex, especially if he wanted another heir, but otherwise you'd live separate lives under the same roof. Some couples barely saw each other because the husband was always away, off at war, at court, managing other estates, traveling. You might go months without seeing him. Your daily life would just be managing the household and raising the children alone. This could be lonely, or it could be a relief, depending on what the husband was like. Some women thrived when their husbands were away because they could actually make decisions and run things without interference. Then the husband would come home and upset everything, countermand your orders, make changes, criticize how you'd been managing things, even though everything had been running fine without him. Other husbands trusted their wives and left them to it. When they came home, they'd review what had been done, approve of it, and not interfere. These were the smart ones. Now let's talk about children, because if you were married, you were probably spending a good chunk of your life pregnant or recovering from pregnancy or caring for young children. Noblewomen didn't usually raise their own children in the hands-on way we think of now. You'd have wet nurses, nursemaids, governesses, other people doing the actual day-to-day care. But you were still involved, especially when the children were young. You'd visit the nursery, check on them, oversee their care, make sure the nurses were doing their jobs properly. Hold your babies, play with your toddlers, teach them their prayers. As the children got older, their education became part of your responsibility, at least for the girls. You'd teach your daughters the skills they'd need as noblewomen: needlework, household management, proper behavior, reading if you were literate. You'd also arrange for tutors if you wanted your children to have more formal education. Latin tutors, music teachers, dancing masters. All of this had to be organized and paid for and supervised. Your sons would eventually be sent away for training. They'd join another noble household as pages, then squires, learning the skills of knighthood and courtly behavior. This was expected, but it must have been hard. Your little boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, sent off to live with strangers. You might not see him for months or years. Daughters might also be sent away to serve in other households, learning how to be proper noblewomen by serving a duchess or queen. Or they'd stay home until they married, which could be very young, 12, 13, 14.
Arranging your children's marriages was a major part of your role as a mother. You'd be involved in the negotiations, discussing dowries and terms with your husband and with the families of potential spouses. You'd meet the candidates if possible, though sometimes marriages were arranged between families who'd never met. Then you'd have to prepare your daughter for marriage, explain what was expected of her, make sure she had the skills and knowledge she'd need, put together her trousseau, all the clothes and household goods she'd take to her new home. And then you'd send her off to marry someone who was probably a stranger, often much older than her, to live in an unfamiliar place with new people, knowing she'd go through the same dangerous cycle of pregnancy and childbirth you'd been through. Some mothers and daughters maintained close relationships through letters after the daughter married. Other times you might not see your daughter again for years or ever, depending on where she married and how far away it was. Child mortality was high, so you'd probably lose some of your children. Illness, accidents, childbirth for your daughters. Every noblewoman knew the grief of losing children. You'd mourn, pray for their souls, try to bear it with patience and faith, because that's what was expected.
Some women were absolutely devastated by child loss and never really recovered. Others had to keep going because they had other children who needed them. You'd bury a baby and a few months later be pregnant again. The cycle just continued.
Let's shift to talking about widowhood, because that was another major life stage that changed your daily routine completely. If your husband died, your situation depended entirely on what arrangements had been made. In the best case, you'd have dower rights, a portion of your husband's estate that was legally yours for life. This gave you income and independence. You might also be given custody of your children if they were minors, though this wasn't guaranteed. Sometimes the children's guardianship went to someone else, and you'd have to fight for the right to raise your own kids. As a widow, you had choices you'd never had before. You could stay single and manage your dower lands yourself. You could retire to a convent, or you could remarry. Remarrying meant giving up your independence to a new husband who'd control your property, but it also meant protection, status, possibly more children. Younger widows often remarried by choice or because their families pressured them. Older widows often chose to stay single. Finally, after years of being under male authority, they had some freedom. They could manage their own estates, make their own decisions, live their own lives within the bounds of what was socially acceptable. Some widows became powerful figures. They'd use their wealth and connections to influence politics, arrange advantageous marriages for their children and grandchildren, patronize the arts and religion. Finally, they had agency. Other widows struggled. If your husband had been in debt, you might inherit his financial problems. If your dower rights weren't properly secured, you might end up poor, despite having been married to a nobleman. You'd have to petition the king or whoever was in charge, begging for what you were legally owed. Your daily life as a widow could be much quieter. No husband to attend to. If your children were grown and married, you might be alone except for your household servants. You'd spend your time on estate management, prayer, reading, maybe some embroidery, visiting your children and grandchildren if they were nearby. Some widows found this peaceful. Others were lonely. You'd spent your whole life surrounded by people, and now, suddenly, you were the old widow living in the dower house, no longer central to anything. Wealthy widows often increased their religious patronage. You'd give money to churches and monasteries, fund masses for your dead husband's soul and your own, commission beautiful religious objects. This was spiritually important, but also kept your name and memory alive. Let's talk about the political aspects of noblewomen's lives, because even though women couldn't hold formal political office in most places, they were still involved in politics. Your marriage was political. Your children's marriages were political. Your household was a political space. Who you invited, who you showed favor to, who you snubbed, all of it mattered politically. At court, this was even more intense. Court ladies were constantly navigating political currents. Whose faction were you part of? Who were you friendly with? Who were you avoiding? Everything you did was observed and interpreted. Queens had to be the most careful. A queen's favor could make someone's career. Her disapproval could ruin someone. She had to balance different factions, manage relationships with powerful nobles, support her husband's policies while also maintaining her own network of influence. Queen's consort didn't have formal power, but they had informal influence. They could whisper in the king's ear. They could promote certain people for positions. They could build alliances through marriages and patronage. Some queens were very good at this. Eleanor of Aquitaine, before her imprisonment, was deeply involved in politics. Margaret of Anjou, Queen of England during the Wars of the Roses, basically led the Lancastrian faction after her husband, Henry VI, had a mental breakdown. She was out there raising armies and making battle plans while he was catatonic. The daily life of a politically active queen was exhausting. Constant meetings, negotiations, letter writing, strategic planning, all while also fulfilling the ceremonial duties of queenship, attending state functions, hosting foreign visitors, maintaining the proper image.
And you had to be careful, because one wrong move could be disastrous. Queens who were too politically active got accused of overstepping. You were supposed to influence things subtly, not obviously grab for power. Queens who weren't politically active enough could also be criticized for not supporting their husbands properly, or for being useless. You had to walk this impossible line between too involved and not involved enough. Letter writing was a huge part of political life for noble women. If you were literate, you'd spend time composing letters to family members, political allies, religious figures. These letters maintained relationships, conveyed news, asked for favors, offered support. You wouldn't write the letters yourself with your own hand, usually. You'd dictate to a secretary who'd write it out properly, but the words were yours. You'd think carefully about what to say and how to say it. Some noble women's letters survive, and they're fascinating. You can see their personalities, their concerns, their relationships. Some wrote warm, affectionate letters to their children. Others wrote terse business communications. Some were witty and charming. Others were blunt and demanding. The Paston letters from 15th century England include lots of letters from the women of the Paston family, and they're wonderful. Margaret Paston writing to her husband about managing their estates while he's in London. Marjorie Paston writing about her controversial marriage. These women were smart, capable, and not afraid to speak their minds, at least in private correspondence.
Your daily routine might include an hour or two of dictating letters, catching up on correspondence, maintaining your network. This was work, genuine political and social work. Now let's talk about something we haven't covered much. What happened when things went wrong? When the normal daily routine got disrupted by crisis? War was a constant possibility. If war came to your region, your daily life changed dramatically. If your castle was besieged, you might be stuck inside for weeks or months. Supplies running low, everyone tense and frightened, the constant threat of the walls being breached. Some noblewomen defended their castles personally when their husbands were away. Nicola de la Haye held Lincoln Castle against a siege in 1217. She was in her 60s, and when the king asked if she wanted to be relieved of her castellan duties because they were too hard, she basically said, "I can manage, thanks," and continued running the castle's defense. Black Agnes, Countess of Dunbar, defended her castle against English siege in 1338.
The English bombarded the castle with stones from siege engines, and Agnes supposedly had her maids ostentatiously dust off the battlements where the stones hit, showing how little she cared about the English weapons. She held out for weeks until relief came. These were exceptional women, but it shows that noblewomen could and did take on military leadership when necessary. Your daily routine would shift from managing household affairs to managing a siege defense, overseeing supplies, maintaining morale, making strategic decisions about when to sally forth or when to wait.
Plague was another disaster that could upend everything. When plague came through, your daily routine became about survival. You'd try to isolate your household, turn away strangers, pray constantly. If someone in your household got sick, you'd nurse them or have them isolated and cared for by others. Many noblewomen died in plague outbreaks. Wealth didn't protect you from disease. You'd watch people around you get sick and die, and there was nothing you could do except pray and hope you'd be spared. Fire was a constant danger in castles and manor houses. Everything was wood, stone, and fabric. Candles and torches and kitchen fires everywhere. One accident and the whole place could go up. If your home burned, you'd lose everything: clothes, jewels, books, furniture, the structure itself. You'd have to relocate to another property if you had one, or stay with family and start rebuilding your household from scratch. Political upheaval could also destroy your daily life. If your husband ended up on the losing side of a power struggle, your family could lose everything. Estates confiscated, titles stripped, maybe your husband executed for treason. You might be left destitute, or you might be married off to someone on the winning side, a political tool to legitimize their claim to your former husband's lands. Your whole life upended, everything you knew gone. Some women navigated these disasters cleverly. They'd switch sides at the right moment, make deals to protect their children, find new husbands who could restore their position. Others were less fortunate and ended up impoverished or worse. Let's talk about age and what happened to noblewomen as they got older, because that changed your daily routine too. If you made it to old age, which many women didn't, you'd probably be a widow. Your role shifted from active household management to more of an advisory position. Your adult children would be running their own households. You might live with one of them or in your own dower property. Your days would be quieter, more prayer, definitely. Old age was for preparing your soul for death. You'd be making arrangements for your burial, funding prayers for your soul, trying to secure a good afterlife. You might also be consulted for your wisdom and experience. Families would ask your advice on marriages, politics, household matters. You were the matriarch, the connection to the previous generation. Physically, old age was hard. Arthritis, failing eyesight, hearing loss, dental problems, general aches and pains. You'd move more slowly, need help with things you used to do yourself. Your ladies would assist you more, cutting up your food if your teeth were bad, guiding you if your vision was poor. But some women stayed sharp and active into old age. Eleanor of Aquitaine, traveling over mountains in her 70s. Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII, staying politically active and managing her estates into her 60s. These women didn't let age slow them down much.
Others were ready to retire from the world. They'd enter a convent for their final years, or just withdraw from public life. Their daily routine became very small and quiet. Prayer, a little light reading or needlework if their eyes still worked, sitting in the sun, being cared for by servants. Death, when it came, would ideally happen with time for preparation. You'd receive the last sacraments, say goodbye to your family, make final bequests. Your household would gather around. Prayers would be said continuously. Then you'd be buried, probably in a church or monastery you'd patronized during life. A tomb would be built, maybe with an effigy of you in stone, hands folded in prayer, dressed in your finest. Your family would fund masses for your soul, and life would go on without you. Your possessions would be distributed, your jewels divided among daughters and daughters-in-law, your books going to whoever appreciated them, your household disbanded, the servants finding new positions. The daily routine you'd maintained for decades would dissolve, replaced by someone else's. Let's drift back to talking about the creative and intellectual lives of noblewomen, because not everything was drudgery and obligation.
Some noblewomen were genuinely learned and intellectual. They collected books, corresponded with scholars, discussed theology and philosophy. This was rarer than it should have been, but it happened. Particularly in the later medieval period and into the Renaissance, there was more opportunity for women's education. Wealthy families might hire tutors for their daughters as well as their sons. Girls would learn Latin, study classical texts, learn about history and rhetoric. Women like Margaret More, Thomas More's daughter, were educated to the same level as men. She could read and write Latin and Greek, engage in theological debates, translate texts. Her daily routine included hours of serious study, not just decorative accomplishments. These educated women sometimes participated in the intellectual movements of their time. They corresponded with humanist scholars, discussed new ideas, contributed to debates. They were taken seriously, or as seriously as women could be in a deeply misogynistic culture. Most noblewomen weren't scholars, but many were patrons of learning in the arts. You might commission manuscripts, fund scholars, support poets and musicians. This was part of your role as a wealthy, cultured person. Patronage took time and attention. You'd meet with artists and authors, discuss what you wanted commissioned, review their work, arrange payment. You'd display the finished works, showing off your taste and wealth. Some women had specific artistic interests: music, poetry, visual arts. They'd cultivate these interests, build collections, support artists working in those fields. Marguerite of Navarre, sister of King Francis I of France, was a writer and intellectual. She wrote poetry and prose, hosted a salon where intellectuals gathered to discuss ideas, corresponded with religious reformers. Her daily life included serious reading, writing, and intellectual engagement alongside her duties as a royal princess. Isabella d'Este, Marquisess of Mantua, was one of the great art patrons of the Renaissance. She commissioned works from Leonardo da Vinci, Titian, and other masters. She collected antiques, built a famous studiolo, and corresponded with artists and scholars across Europe. Managing her art collection and cultural patronage was a significant part of her daily routine.
These women used their wealth and position to engage with culture and learning in ways that made their lives richer and more meaningful. They weren't just passive consumers. They shaped artistic and intellectual trends through their patronage and participation. For less exalted noblewomen, creative outlets were more modest. You might write poetry for your own amusement, keep a journal or commonplace book, create beautiful embroideries not because you had to, but because you enjoyed it, cultivate an exceptional garden. These small creative acts made daily life more bearable. Let's talk about friendship and the relationships noblewomen had with each other, because that's something we haven't explored much.
Your ladies-in-waiting and companions were with you constantly. You'd develop close relationships with some of them. Real friendships, not just mistress and servant relationships. You'd share confidences, support each other through difficulties, celebrate happy occasions together. These women knew you intimately. They saw you at your worst, sick or grieving or angry. They helped you through childbirth, mourned with you when children died, celebrated with you at weddings. Some of these friendships lasted for life. A trusted lady who'd been with you since you were young might stay with you for decades. You'd arrange good marriages for her, help her children, provide for her in old age. The bonds between women in a household could be strong. You were living together, working together, sharing this strange, restricted life together. You understood each other in ways men didn't. There was also rivalry and conflict, of course, jealousy over who was most favored, disagreements about household matters, personality clashes. Sometimes a noblewoman and her ladies-in-waiting couldn't stand each other, but were stuck together anyway. But many women found genuine companionship and support in their female networks. Your female relatives, your ladies, wives of other nobles you'd befriended. These relationships enriched daily life and provided emotional support.
Letters between noble women show real affection and intimacy. Women writing to their sisters or daughters or friends with warmth and care. Sharing news, asking for advice, offering comfort during hard times. When you were going through something difficult, pregnancy or illness or grief, your female network rallied around you. They'd visit, send comforting letters, pray for you. This support was crucial in a world where life was so often hard and dangerous. Now let's talk about the differences in daily life across different time periods, because a noblewoman's routine in 1200 was different from one in 1500. In the earlier medieval period, things were rougher and simpler. Castles were cold, drafty military structures. Comfort was minimal. Your daily routine was more focused on basic survival and household management. There was less emphasis on elaborate courtesy and culture. As you move into the later Middle Ages, things became more refined. Castles and manor houses became more comfortable. There was more wealth, more trade, more access to luxury goods. Your daily routine might include more elaborate dress, more sophisticated entertainment, more cultural engagement. The concept of courtly love developed and became part of aristocratic culture. This whole elaborate game where knights supposedly worshipped ladies from afar, writing poetry and performing deeds in their honor. As a noblewoman, you'd be part of this game, accepting a knight's devotion, giving your favor, playing the role of the unattainable lady.
It was all very formalized and mostly not serious, but it added flavor to court life. Tournaments and feasts became more elaborate with more ceremony and spectacle. Into the Renaissance, education for noblewomen improved in some places. More women learning Latin, studying classical texts. The printing press made books more available. Wealthy women could build substantial libraries. But in other ways, things got more restrictive. The Protestant Reformation closed convents in Protestant areas, which removed one of the few options women had besides marriage. The witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries created new dangers, especially for women who were too independent or knowledgeable about herbs and healing. The basic structure of noble women's daily lives stayed fairly consistent across centuries. Wake, pray, household duties, needlework, meals, more prayer, sleep. But the details and the cultural context shifted. Throughout all of it, though, the fundamental reality remained. Noblewomen had wealth and status, but they had very little freedom. Their lives were not their own. They were daughters, wives, mothers, widows, always defined by their relationship to men, always expected to be obedient, pious, chaste, quiet. Some women accepted this and found happiness within these constraints. They embraced their roles, found meaning in faith and family, and lived peacefully.
Others chafed against the restrictions. They pushed boundaries where they could, carved out spaces for themselves, asserted what little agency they had. Some got away with it. Others faced consequences. And many probably never questioned it at all. This was just how things were, how they'd always been. What else would you expect? You were born into this life, raised to fulfill this role, and you did it because that's what women did. Let's get into some really specific daily schedules, because talking about routines in general is one thing, but let's actually walk through what a day might look like hour by hour. Imagine you're a noblewoman in England around 1450. Not a queen, but someone fairly high status, maybe a countess. You have a large household, multiple estates, significant wealth. Here's what your day might actually look like. You'd wake up around dawn, maybe 5 or 6 in the morning, depending on the season. Your ladies would already be stirring because they needed to be ready before you. One of them would gently wake you if you weren't already awake. You'd say a quick private prayer while still in bed, then you'd get up and use the chamber pot, which one of your ladies would discreetly handle. Privacy, as we've mentioned, wasn't really a thing. Then you'd wash. There'd be a basin of water, maybe warmed if you were lucky and it was winter. You'd wash your face and hands, a cloth to dry off. If you were particularly fastidious, you might wash more thoroughly, but full baths were infrequent, maybe once a month if you were unusually clean. Some people bathed even less. Now the dressing process begins. We've covered this, but let's be specific. First, your chemise, the linen undershift. Then your stockings, tied up with garters. Then your kirtle, which was like a fitted underdress. Your ladies would lace this up the back, pulling it tight. Then your gown over that. This was probably wool, nicely dyed, well made, but not overly elaborate for a regular day. More lacing. Then a belt at your waist, probably decorative with metalwork. Then your sleeves, which were separate pieces that attached to the gown, pinned or tied or buttoned, depending on the style. Then your headdress, In 1450, you might be wearing a butterfly hennin, or a truncated hennin, or perhaps a heart-shaped headdress. Whatever it was, it involved wrapping your hair, which had been braided, and then arranging fabric and wire and pins until you had the proper silhouette. This took a while. Your ladies had practice, but it still might be 20 minutes just for your head. Jewelry, rings definitely, maybe a necklace, a brooch to fasten your gown. These weren't just decorative, they showed your status and wealth. By the time you were fully dressed, an hour had passed. It's now around 7 in the morning. You'd go to your private chapel or the castle chapel for morning prayers. This wasn't a quick thing. Matins and lauds if you were following the liturgical hours. Prayers, psalms, perhaps a short mass. You're kneeling on the cold stone floor, or maybe you had a cushion if you were fancy. Half an hour, maybe 45 minutes. Then you'd break your fast. Probably just bread and ale in your chamber, maybe some cheese. Nothing elaborate. You'd eat while one of your ladies read to you, or while you discussed the day's plans with your chief lady-in-waiting.
Now it's around 8 or 8:30, and you'd meet with your steward. He'd give you reports on the household, what supplies came in yesterday, what needs to be ordered, any issues with servants, problems with the estate that need your attention. You'd review accounts, not line by line, but checking that everything looked reasonable. You'd make decisions about household matters. Yes, order more wax for candles. No, we don't need new livery for the servants yet. Deal with that drainage problem in the lower field. This might take an hour. Now it's 9:30 or so. Time for the solar. You'd go to your private sitting room with your ladies. Everyone would settle in with their needlework. You're working on an altar cloth that you've been stitching for 3 months and will probably work on for another 6 months. It's going to be beautiful when it's done, but right now you're only about a quarter finished. Someone would read aloud, maybe a romance, maybe a saint's life. You'd all sew and listen. Occasionally someone would comment on the story or mention some bit of gossip. Did you hear that Lady So-and-so's daughter is betrothed to that northern baron, the one whose first wife died under mysterious circumstances? You'd stitch and stitch. Hours would pass. Your eyes would get tired. Your back would hurt from sitting hunched over. But this is what you do.
Around noon, a servant would announce that dinner was ready. You'd put away your needlework carefully and process down to the great hall. Dinner was the main meal. It was formal. You'd sit at the high table. If your husband was home, he'd sit in the center, you next to him. Other family members and important guests in order of rank. Hand washing first. A servant with a basin and pitcher would come around. You'd wash your hands over the basin, dry them on the towel offered. Then the food would come, course after course. Let's say it was a regular day, not a feast. You might have pottage, a thick soup or stew, roasted meat, maybe venison or pork, fish if it was a fast day, and there were a lot of fast days. Bread, obviously, cheese, some kind of pie, fruit if it was in season, wine or ale to drink. You'd eat delicately, small bites. Use your knife to cut meat, your spoon for pottage, your fingers for bread and cheese. Wipe your fingers on your napkin, not the tablecloth. Make polite conversation with whoever was sitting near you. The meal might last an hour or more, not because you were eating the whole time, but because it was a social occasion. Courses came out slowly. There was conversation. Maybe some entertainment, musicians playing. When dinner was finally over, more hand-washing. Then you'd be free to leave the hall. Back to the solar for more needlework, probably, though maybe you'd walk in the garden if the weather was nice. Get some air, look at the flowers or herbs growing, enjoy a few minutes of relative freedom. Or maybe you'd play a game, chess with one of your ladies, or tables, which was like backgammon, something to break up the afternoon. If you had business to attend to, you might dictate letters, correspondence with family members, other nobles, religious houses you patronized. Your secretary would write while you spoke. Then you'd review what he'd written and approve it or make changes. The afternoon would drift by. More prayer at some point because there were set hours for prayer and you were supposed to observe them. More needlework, maybe some reading if you had a new book you were enjoying. Around 5 or 6, supper would be served. This was lighter than dinner. Cold meats, bread, cheese, maybe some fruit preserves. Less formal. You might eat in your chamber with your ladies rather than in the hall. After supper, the evening stretched ahead. In winter, when it got dark early, you'd be by candlelight or firelight. Expensive, so you wouldn't waste it. You'd gather with your household in the solar or the hall. More entertainment. Music, maybe. Someone playing the lute or harp, singing. People loved songs. Ballads about romance and adventure. Hymns, silly songs that everyone knew. Or storytelling. Someone would tell a tale. Ghost stories were popular. Local legends. Stories about fairies and saints and heroes. Everyone would listen. The firelight flickering, shadows dancing on the walls. Or you just talk. Gossip. Discuss news from other parts of the country. Talk about marriages and politics and who was feuding with whom. As bedtime approached, evening prayers, vespers and compline if you were observing the hours properly, more kneeling, more prayers, preparing your soul for sleep and possible death because you never knew if you'd wake up. Then the undressing process, your ladies helping you out of all those layers, unpinning your headdress, unlacing your gown, removing sleeves and kirtle and all of it until you were down to your chemise. They'd help you into your night shift. Brush your hair if it needed it. Make sure you had water if you got thirsty in the night. Make sure the chamber pot was accessible. Then into bed. Your ladies would settle down in their own beds in your chamber or the adjoining room. A single candle might be left burning, or maybe not. And you'd sleep, ready to do the entire thing again tomorrow. That was a normal day. Nothing special, no crisis, no visitors, no major events. Just the routine that filled day after day, week after week, year after year. Let's talk about the differences in daily routine depending on where you lived. Because a noblewoman in Italy had a different experience than one in England or Scandinavia. In Italy, especially in the Renaissance period, Noblewomen might have more access to culture and education. Italian courts were centers of art and learning. If you were part of one of the ruling families, your daily life might include salons where poets and artists gathered. You might be more directly involved in patronage, commissioning works, discussing art and literature with the people creating it. The climate was warmer, so your daily routine could include more outdoor time. Gardens were more elaborate. Your clothing was different, influenced by Italian fashion, which was distinct from Northern European styles. In Spain, noble women's lives were influenced by the mixing of Christian, Muslim, and Jewish cultures, at least until the Reconquista was complete and the Jews were expelled. Some Spanish noblewomen had access to learning from all three traditions. They might read texts that weren't available elsewhere in Europe. But Spanish noblewomen were also often more restricted in some ways. The concept of honor was intense. Your behavior reflected on your entire family's honor. Any hint of impropriety could be disastrous, so your daily life might be more carefully supervised, more restricted. In Scandinavia, noble women dealt with harsh winters that limited activity for months. Your daily routine in the depths of winter meant being stuck inside almost constantly. But Scandinavian women also had some traditions of more independence. Viking-age traditions hadn't completely disappeared. Women managing farms and estates while men were away wasn't unusual. In the Byzantine Empire, before it fell, noble women lived under different customs entirely, more influenced by Eastern traditions. Different dress, different daily routines, different expectations. Byzantine noblewomen might be more secluded, living in separate women's quarters. Or they might be powerful political figures influencing imperial policy. The basic structure was similar everywhere: prayer, household management, needlework, meals, but the details varied significantly. Let's talk about something we've touched on but not explored deeply: the mental and emotional health of noblewomen living these restricted lives. Depression must have been common, though they didn't call it that. Melancholy, they might say, an imbalance of humors. But whatever you called it, the reality of being trapped in a life you didn't choose, going through the same routine endlessly, dealing with grief and fear and powerlessness, that takes a toll. Some women probably suffered from what we'd now recognize as depression or anxiety, spending days in their chambers, unable to face the routine, going through the motions but feeling nothing. The medical understanding of the time was useless. You might be bled, given herbal tonics that didn't help, told to pray more. Postpartum depression after childbirth was probably common, but not understood. You'd just given birth, you were exhausted and in pain, your body was a mess, and everyone expected you to be joyful about the baby. If you weren't, if you felt empty or sad or terrified, that was seen as ungrateful or even sinful. Anxiety about childbirth, about your children's health, about your family's political situation, all of this was rational, but you were expected to bear it with patience and faith. Falling apart wasn't an option. Some women coped by throwing themselves into religion. If you were devout enough, pious enough, maybe God would protect you and your family. Maybe your suffering had spiritual meaning. This could be genuinely comforting, or it could be just another form of self-torture. Others coped by focusing on the small pleasures: your garden, your books, your friendships. finding meaning in little things because the big things were out of your control. And some women just broke. There are records of noblewomen having what we might call mental breakdowns, refusing to leave their chambers, behaving erratically, having fits or visions. Sometimes this was interpreted as demonic possession, sometimes as divine inspiration. Either way, it was disruptive. Juana of Castile, known as Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, is the most famous example. Her mental health deteriorated after her husband died. She supposedly refused to be separated from his coffin, traveling around with his coffin. She was eventually confined by her father and then her son, living in isolation for decades. How much of her behavior was genuine mental illness and how much was exaggerated by people who wanted her out of the way, we don't know. But either way, her daily life became imprisonment in a tower, cut off from the world, for almost 50 years. That's an extreme case, but it shows how noblewomen dealing with mental health crises had no real help available and could end up in terrible situations. Let's talk about abuse, because that was a reality for some noblewomen, and it shaped their daily lives completely. If your husband was cruel, you were stuck with him. You couldn't divorce except in extremely rare circumstances. Annulments required papal approval and usually only happened for political reasons, not because your husband beat you. Some noblemen were violent toward their wives. They'd hit them, scream at them, humiliate them publicly. The wife's daily routine became about trying not to provoke him, walking on eggshells, trying to protect his moods and avoid his anger. There wasn't really recourse. You could complain to your male relatives, and if your family was powerful enough, they might pressure your husband to behave better. But often, domestic situations were considered private. What a man did to his wife in his own home was his business. Church authorities might get involved in extreme cases. If a husband's cruelty was really outrageous, a bishop might rebuke him. But this was rare and not very effective. So women in abusive marriages just endured. Their daily life was surviving, getting through each day, protecting their children if they could, hoping their husband would die and free them. Some women ran away, which was a huge scandal and also very risky. Where would you go? Back to your birth family if they'd take you, though this was humiliating for everyone. A convent, maybe, though your husband could probably force you out unless you took formal vows. Running away also meant giving up your children, who legally belonged to your husband. Most women couldn't do it. Sexual abuse within marriage was just called marriage. The concept of marital consent didn't really exist. Your husband had conjugal rights. Whether you wanted sex or not was irrelevant. This was your duty. If your husband forced himself on you, hurt you, demanded things you found degrading, you had no recourse. This was just what wives endured. For your daily life might include dreading nighttime when your husband would come to your chamber, hoping he'd stay away, hoping he was with a mistress instead of with you. What a thing to hope for, that your husband preferred someone else. Not all marriages were like this, obviously. Some husbands were kind, or at least not cruel. Some couples developed mutual affection and respect. But for the women in bad marriages, daily life was endurance and survival. Let's shift to something less grim. Let's talk about fashion and beauty routines in more detail, because this took up time in noblewomen's daily lives. Fashion was important.
What you wore signaled your status, your wealth, your taste. You needed to keep up with current styles, especially if you were at court. Styles changed over time. In the 14th century, you might wear a sideless surcoat that showed your fitted kirtle underneath. Very fashionable and also very expensive because you needed 2 elaborate garments. In the 15th century, those tall hennins were in style. The higher and more elaborate, the better. You'd have veils hanging from them, flowing down your back. In the 16th century, fashions got more structured, farthingales making skirts stand out, elaborate ruffs around your neck, tight bodices, huge sleeves. Getting dressed became even more complicated. Following fashion meant constantly ordering new clothes, meeting with your tailor or seamstress, choosing fabrics, discussing trim and decoration, making sure you had appropriate garments for different occasions. Your daily routine might include time spent with your wardrobe, deciding what to wear, making sure your clothes were in good condition, storing them properly so they didn't get damaged by moths or mildew.
Jewelry was also important. You'd have pieces that signaled your status. Maybe a ring from your husband, a necklace that had been in your family for generations, brooches, pins, decorative girdles. You'd need to keep track of all of it, make sure nothing was lost or stolen. Maybe you had an inventory, a written list of everything you owned. Your most trusted lady might be in charge of your jewel casket. Beauty routines were less involved than they'd become in later centuries, but there were still standards. Pale skin was desirable, showing you didn't have to work outside. You might use white lead makeup to lighten your skin, which was poisonous and slowly destroyed your skin and health, but beauty standards have never been especially concerned with health. Plucking your hairline back was fashionable in some periods. A high forehead was considered beautiful, so you'd pluck hair to make your forehead appear higher, painful and time-consuming. Your hair itself was supposed to be covered once you were married, but underneath the headdress you still needed to care for it, washing it occasionally with herbal rinses, brushing it, though this might not be daily because people didn't have the same hair care routines we do now. You might use scented oils or perfumes. These were expensive and special. Rose water was popular, other floral scents. These masked body odor, which was definitely a thing since bathing was infrequent.
Teeth cleaning was done with cloths and various powders or pastes. Some of these were abrasive and probably wore down tooth enamel. But you'd try to keep your teeth clean and your breath fresh. All of this self-care and fashion maintenance was part of your daily routine. You were expected to be beautiful, or at least well presented. Looking good was part of your job. Let's talk about the information networks that noblewomen maintained, because this was actually significant. Women talked, they gossiped, they shared information, and this created networks of knowledge that could be quite powerful. Your ladies-in-waiting heard things from servants, who heard things from other servants, who heard things in other households. Information traveled through these informal networks. You'd hear about political developments sometimes before official news arrived. You'd know who was marrying whom, who was in favor at court, who'd fallen out of favor, who was sick, who died.
This information was valuable.
It helped you navigate social and political situations. It let you prepare for changes that might affect your family. Women's letters also carried information. You'd write to your female relatives and friends, sharing news. They'd write back with their news. Information circulated through these letter networks. Some women became known as good sources of information. If you wanted to know what was really happening at court, you'd write to a certain lady who always seemed to know everything. This information gathering was part of your daily routine. Talking with your ladies, reading letters, synthesizing information from different sources. You were keeping track of your world, staying informed. And you'd use this information strategically, warn your family about political developments, arrange advantageous marriages for your children, position yourself and your household appropriately. Men often underestimated these female information networks. They thought women were just gossiping about trivial things, but women were actually maintaining sophisticated intelligence networks that operated parallel to official channels.
Let's talk about the physical spaces noblewomen inhabited, because the architecture of castles and manor houses shaped daily life. Earlier castles were military structures, stone walls, small windows, minimal comfort. Your chambers would be drafty and cold. Fireplaces helped, but they weren't very efficient. Smoke often filled the room. In winter, you'd be cold pretty much constantly. Your solar might be on an upper floor, trying to catch sunlight. It would have larger windows than other rooms, hence the name. But glass was expensive, so windows might be covered with oiled cloth or shutters. Let light in, but also cold air. The Great Hall was the center of household life, a large room where people gathered, ate, slept. As a noblewoman, you'd pass through it regularly, but you also had the privilege of private chambers. Privacy was relative, though. Your chambers weren't far from the hall. People were constantly coming and going. Servants, ladies-in-waiting, petitioners, messengers. You couldn't really be alone. The chapel was attached to or near the main residence. You'd walk there multiple times a day for prayers and services. Gardens, if they existed, were enclosed. High walls creating private outdoor spaces. These were precious. You could be outside, but still protected and secluded. The garderobe, the medieval toilet, was usually built into the thickness of the wall, a little closet with a hole that dropped down to the moat or a cesspit below. Not pleasant, but functional. You'd use it privately, or as privately as anything was, with maybe just one lady attending you. Later castles and manor houses became more comfortable, more rooms, more specialized spaces, a withdrawing chamber where you could actually withdraw from public areas, better fireplaces, glass windows becoming more common. By the Renaissance, if you were very wealthy, your home might be quite comfortable. Multiple rooms, real privacy, better heating, more light. Your daily routine could happen in more pleasant surroundings. But the basic layout still encouraged communal living. You were never really alone. Your life played out in shared spaces, witnessed by your household. Let's talk about the transitions in life and how they affected daily routines. Going from your birth family to your husband's household was a massive transition. Suddenly you were living with strangers, new customs, new expectations, new dynamics. You'd have to learn how this household operated, win over your mother-in-law, who now had authority over you, figure out your place in the hierarchy. Your daily routine would be uncertain at first. You'd watch what other people did and try to fit in. Eventually, you'd establish your own routine, and if you were the wife of the heir, you'd eventually take over running the household yourself. But that transition period must have been stressful. Everything new and unfamiliar. Missing your birth family, trying to please your new husband and his family, hoping you'd get pregnant quickly to prove your worth. Becoming a mother changed your daily routine. Now you had children to think about. Visiting the nursery became part of your day, overseeing their care, checking on their health, spending time with them. As your children grew, your role shifted, teaching them, arranging their educations, planning their futures. This added new tasks to your daily routine. Watching your children leave was another transition. Sons going off for nightly training, daughters marrying and leaving for their husbands' homes. Your daily routine would feel empty suddenly. Rooms that had been full of children's noise, now quiet. You'd shift focus to other things. Estate management, religious devotion, relationships with adult children and grandchildren. Becoming a widow, as we've discussed, was a major transition. Your daily routine changed completely. More freedom, but also more responsibility, and possibly more loneliness. Each of these transitions required adapting, learning a new daily routine, finding new rhythms and purposes. Let's look at a few more specific historical women and how they spent their days. Margaret Paston, who we mentioned before, lived in 15th century England. We have many of her letters, so we know a lot about her daily life. She managed estates while her husband was in London dealing with legal affairs. Her days were filled with estate business, dealing with tenants, overseeing repairs, handling disputes, defending properties from people trying to seize them. She wrote constantly to her husband about what was happening, asking for instructions, reporting on what she'd done, updating him on political and social news.
She also managed her household, raised her children, maintained social relationships with neighboring gentry families. Her letters show her as capable, intelligent, sometimes sharp-tempered, deeply engaged with her world. Her daily routine was busy. She wasn't sitting around doing needlework all day. She was actively managing complex affairs, and she was good at it. Isabella of France, Queen of England, wife of Edward II, had a daily routine that shifted dramatically over her life. As queen, she fulfilled the usual duties, court ceremonies, religious observances, hosting, being decorative. But her husband preferred his male favorites to her. He spent money on them, showered them with honors, possibly had intimate relationships with them. Isabella's daily life included being humiliated and sidelined in her own court. Eventually, she'd had enough. She went to France, supposedly on diplomatic business, and then refused to return. She took a lover, Roger Mortimer. They gathered an army and invaded England, deposed Edward II, ruled as regents for Isabella's young son. So Isabella's daily routine went from ignored queen doing ceremonial duties to political revolutionary ruling a kingdom. She made decisions about governance, military campaigns, executions. Her daily life was active, powerful, until her son Edward III came of age and overthrew her regency. Then Isabella's daily routine became quiet retirement. She lived in comfortable confinement for nearly 30 years, back to prayer, needlework, and waiting. One woman, multiple completely different daily routines depending on her circumstances. Caterina Sforza, an Italian noblewoman of the late 15th century, had a famously eventful life. Her daily routine included typical noblewoman stuff, managing her household, raising her children, but she also personally defended her territories. When her fortress was besieged, she stood on the walls and reportedly shouted defiance at her enemies. She studied alchemy and medicine. Her daily routine included time in her laboratory, experimenting with recipes for cosmetics, poisons, and medicines. She compiled her experiments into a book of recipes. After her territories were conquered and she was imprisoned, her daily routine became confinement. She eventually was released and retired to Florence, where she spent her final years in quieter pursuits. Anne Boleyn, before she became queen, served as a lady-in-waiting at the French court and then the English court. Her daily routine was attending the queen, participating in court life, dancing, playing music, being charming and fashionable. She caught Henry VIII's attention, and her daily life became increasingly complicated, trying to manage the king's obsessive interest, negotiating her rise to power, refusing to become his mistress, holding out for marriage. As queen, her daily routine was the usual queenly duties plus the constant pressure of needing to produce a male heir. She had a daughter, Elizabeth, but no son. Her daily life was filled with anxiety about her position. When she fell from favor, her routine shifted to imprisonment in the Tower of London, waiting for her trial, waiting for execution. Her daily life compressed into a few rooms and a lot of fear. From lady-in-waiting to queen to prisoner to executed, all in a few short years. Daily routines shaped by forces entirely outside her control. Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife, also experienced dramatic shifts in daily routine. As queen, decades of proper queenly behavior, court ceremonies, religious devotion, supporting her husband, raising their daughter Mary. Then Henry decided he wanted an annulment. Catherine's daily routine became fighting for her marriage and her daughter's legitimacy, refusing to accept the annulment, being separated from her daughter, living in increasingly poor conditions as Henry stripped away her status and income. Her final years were spent in cold, damp manor houses with a reduced household, limited funds. Her daily routine became prayer and more prayer, writing letters in her daughter's defense and slowly dying from illness that was probably made worse by stress and poor living conditions. She went from honored queen to discarded wife, and her daily routine reflected that fall. Let's talk about the women who didn't fit the mold, the ones who rejected or couldn't fulfill the expected roles. Women who didn't want to marry and fought against it. They were rare because fighting your family's will was almost impossible. But some women resisted. They begged to be allowed to enter convents instead. Some succeeded. Others were forced to marry anyway. Women who couldn't have children. This was seen as a personal failure and possibly divine punishment. Your daily life would be overshadowed by this perceived failing. People would gossip. Your husband might set you aside or just ignore you. Your value as a wife was diminished. Some women turned to prayer and religious devotion, trying to find purpose outside of motherhood. Others suffered in silence, the emptiness of their nurseries a constant reminder.
Women who were too educated, too outspoken, too independent. They made people uncomfortable. They might be criticized, mocked, even accused of witchcraft if they were too different. Most women who had unconventional interests learned to hide them or at least downplay them. You could be scholarly, but you had to be modest about it. You could be interested in medicine, but you framed it as caring for your household, not as intellectual pursuit. Your daily routine might include secret reading, hidden study, quiet defiance. You learned what you could while maintaining the appearance of conformity. Let's talk about how things slowly started to change. The printing press made books more available. Literacy rates increased. More women could read, could access knowledge. This didn't revolutionize their daily lives overnight, but it opened possibilities. The Protestant Reformation changed religious life dramatically. In Protestant areas, convents were closed. This removed one option for women, but Protestant theology also emphasized literacy and Bible reading. Women were expected to read scripture themselves.
Protestant noblewomen's daily routines included more reading, more engagement with religious texts. Some became quite learned in theology. But Protestant women also lost some of the female saints and the Virgin Mary as intermediaries. The intensely female religious world of medieval Catholicism was diminished. The Renaissance emphasis on education and classical learning affected some noblewomen. Wealthy families in Italy and later in Northern Europe began educating daughters as well as sons. These educated women had daily routines that included serious study, reading classical authors, learning languages, writing. They participated in the intellectual world in ways medieval noblewomen rarely could. But the fundamental structure of noblewomen's lives didn't really change. They still couldn't choose their husbands, still had limited legal rights, still were expected to be primarily wives and mothers. The Enlightenment would bring more changes. The 19th century would bring more. But for most of the medieval and Renaissance periods we've been discussing, noblewomen's daily lives remained constrained by the same basic expectations and limitations.
Let's bring this all together. What can we say about what noblewomen did all day behind castle walls? They prayed, a lot. Hours of their days devoted to religious observance, both public and private. This gave structure and meaning, or it was just another obligation, probably both. They did needlework, endless needlework, embroidery, sewing, weaving, creating beautiful things, and also just filling time. Their fingers always busy, eyes straining over tiny stitches, backs aching from hunching over their work. They managed households, overseeing servants, reviewing accounts, making decisions about supplies and expenditures, running what was essentially a small business, often with no training and limited authority. They had children, over and over, risking death each time, losing many of those children to illness and accident. The cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, recovery, repeat. They navigated social and political worlds, making conversation, writing letters, maintaining relationships, positioning their families advantageously, the soft power of influence and connection.
They endured cold, discomfort, illness, grief, fear, boredom. They endured marriages they didn't choose, lives they didn't design, limitations they couldn't escape. But they also found moments of joy and beauty, a garden in bloom, a new book, a piece of music, a friendship, time with their children, small pleasures that made life bearable. They were people, complex and individual, living within restrictive systems. Some thrived despite the limitations. Some were crushed by them. Most just lived, doing what was expected, because what else could you do? Their daily routines filled thousands and thousands of days. Wake, dress, pray, work, eat, pray, sleep. Again and again, the seasons cycling through, children growing up and leaving, husbands dying, growing old, and finally dying themselves. And the next generation of noblewomen would do the same thing. The same routines, the same expectations, the same struggles. Generation after generation. Were they happy? Some were, some weren't. Most probably experienced both happiness and unhappiness, just like people always do. Their lives mattered. Not because they were noble, but because they were human. They loved and grieved and hoped and feared. They created beautiful things. They raised children. They managed complex affairs. They survived in a world that gave them few choices. What they did all day was live. Within the constraints available to them, they lived their lives. And now, centuries later, we can look back and see the dailiness of their existence, the routine and the ritual, the boredom and the brief joys, the constrained but still human lives they led. So that's what noblewomen did all day behind castle walls. They did what they had to do. They did what they could do. They did what was expected. And sometimes, when possible, they did what they wanted. And then the day ended, and the night came, and they slept, ready to wake up and do it all again tomorrow. Which is, in the end, what most of us do. Different circumstances, different constraints, different possibilities, but the same basic rhythm of daily life. Wake, work, rest, repeat. There's something both deeply sad and oddly comforting about that. These women living hundreds of years ago, their daily routines so different from ours in detail, but so similar in structure, getting through each day, finding meaning where they could, living their lives as best they knew how. And on that gentle note, we'll let them rest, and maybe we should rest too. Another day done, another story told. The noblewomen of the past settling into their sleep behind castle walls, and us settling into ours wherever we are. The routine continues. Wake, live, sleep. For them, for us, for everyone who came before and everyone who'll come after. The endless rhythm of days. And that's enough for tonight. Sleep well.